Agile.FM, radio for the Agile community. www.agile.fm. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Agile.FM, the podcast for the Agile community. And today I have Mark Kilby with me here on the podcast. And Mark is a coach, mentor. He's a community cultivator. You can reach him at markkilby.com, and his Twitter handle is mkilby. Mark will be speaking at the Agile Leadership Conference in Miami, and his talk will be Building Community, the Power of Many. That will be one part of our podcast we're going to talk about today. And the other thing is he works in a very interesting company as an Agile coach. The company is Sonatype. And what's extremely special about this company is it's entirely distributed, if I'm not mistaken. But first of all, welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks, Joe, and I appreciate that nice introduction.
Well, what is Sonatype? Give us a little, give us some parameters about Sonatype. I'm pretty sure a lot of people haven't heard about Sonatype.
What is Sonatype? Yeah, so I refer to Sonatype as as like the BASF of the software industry. You may not know us, but you know how we impact you. So, for instance, we build tools to help you manage open source. So not only dealing with all the different components that you can pull into your from open source, mm-hmm. but also what are some of the security and licensing issues that you might have hidden in that open source, mm-hmm. so that you're not releasing that upon your customers. But because we have those roots in open source, we have this sort of unique way of operating, which is we are about 95% distributed. We actually have a main office in the Washington, D.C. area with a few folks that are based there. But even our executives only meet there once a week. Most of the time, they're working out of their homes. Wow. And the rest of us are spread everywhere from Australia all the way to Alaska.
Oh, my goodness. How big is the company, just in terms of employees?
We're still relatively small. We're just about the 200-person mark. We're growing rapidly right now. Engineering, or what we like to call the product group, we're probably a little bit less than half of that number. Of course, another big hunk is the sales group, and then there's of course marketing, and administration, and finance, and others in there as well. Mm-hmm. But for the engineering teams, they're spread out from Thailand to Alaska. So one of my teams, I have a 3-person team where one person is in Thailand, one is in Las Vegas, and one is in LA.
Oh my goodness, that is quite a distribution here. Before we talk about your role as an Agile coach in an environment like that, and I think listeners right now are thinking about, that is quite a diverse set of countries these people live and work.
Or crazy collection.
Crazy collection, exactly. Before we go to how this impacts you in your Agile work, is like, why is Sonatype distributed?
Well, so some of the original founders of the Apache Maven project were the ones that also founded Sonatype. And so many of them had met in the open source community, were used to working in an open source style. And so when they launched Sonatype, it was not unusual for them to have a few people in Europe and a few people spread across North America. Mm-hmm. And then as they had the need to grow, they just reached out to more people in the open source community that they valued their skill sets and trusted them as collaborators. Mm-hmm. Of course, now these days we're reaching a little bit beyond that. But it's still very much reaching out to whoever are the best and brightest, no matter where they're at, who feel very strongly about improving the open source ecosystem.
Wow. So it's definitely about skill sets and about people that bring the right ingredients to building this product, and they're just distributed, and that's why the company is distributed. Now, the big question I think all the Angelists are waiting for you, the answer is, how does this impact your work as an Agile coach? Usually, and the Agile Manifesto really carries even a statement about face-to-face communication, right? We could say video is somewhat face-to-face, but this is clearly a very different way of working, especially with such a high rate of distribution. How do you operate as an Agile coach?
Right. Well, I can. So the short answer is I still have all my hair. I've not torn it all out. So it's all still firmly implanted. But actually, over most of my coaching career, I have either, whether you consider it fortunate or unfortunate, I have worked with different distributed teams. So for about a period of 5 years, I was with Rally Software, as you might recall, and we dealt with all kinds of teams in different locations. But even before then, with some of the smaller companies I was at, I never. It was actually a luxury for me to have a co-located team. I think probably 90 to 95% of the time, I was dealing with somebody remote, whether it's one or two people working from home or clusters of people, and I always had that situation. So Sonatype for me wasn't that big of a stretch. It was unique in that it was completely distributed, but that was something I had always kind of hypothesized with some of my fellow Agile coaches is, would it work if everyone was equally distributed, if they all had the same kind of setup and not somewhere in the office and somewhere out of a central office? And so far, it's worked quite well. We have, I'm trying to think now, we probably have close to 11 or 12 teams with using a mix of Scrum and Kanban. And some of those teams are collaborating on particular products, so we're dealing with scaling at this point and having those teams collaborate. And basically, many of the same principles apply, just the practices need to be tweaked. Right. And this is something I've been working on for the last few years and starting to blog more about. And as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, I started giving a talk about what were the differences, and actually did a little checklist against the Agile Manifesto. And most of my teams could check off the 4 values. They definitely valued individuals and interactions over processes and tools, but we needed the tools to stay connected. Right. So those are still important to us. And all the principles, all 12 principles applied, just we interpret face-to-face a little differently. So for us, you mentioned how it's valuable to have people with strong skill sets. For us, it's not just the technical skill sets. The communication skill sets are even more important for us than probably any other environment. So when we interview candidates, we'll ask them. Oh,
you're giving secrets away now, Mark. You know that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But when we interview candidates, we'll ask them how they interact with teams now and how much time they've actually worked from home, because we don't want to put them in an awkward situation. But if you've spent some time where you spend maybe 1 week, 2 weeks, or a month working from home, you've learned to start adjusting certain things like over communicating in certain ways than versus what you would do in an office situation. So what you would share maybe verbally in a meeting, you might now also share in chat, in an email, just to get a certain concept across. And so that's something that we tend to we amplify certain things based on how a particular team or team member needs to collaborate.
That's very interesting that you say that the communication skills are actually more important in an environment like this, probably easier in a co-located environment to do this. Do you think knowing, obviously you know the distributed part a little bit more from your experience than the working with co-located teams, but what do you think is easier or harder for the coach? What scenario? Being just
well, so there's definitely a few things that make it more interesting. Retrospectives being one of them. So still very challenging to do those. And this is where you really need to be creative as a coach. So in some cases, it's bringing in different tools or or tweaking some of the techniques in a way that it can still work. So for instance, let's say you're doing an exercise where you might need to create some safety and you need to have it anonymous. Mm-hmm. There's still ways to do that, but you might have to work a little harder as an Agile coach to get that to happen. But it's not impossible.
You mean like voting or something?
Like voting or maybe just gathering insights. And if you need to keep it anonymous, how can you do it so that even you don't see the results or the team trusts you enough that you're not going to share what they send you. Mm-hmm. You're not going to share who sends it, I mean. Mm-hmm. So that's one. Another one is navigating conflict. So that one is definitely more challenging. And what is key there is to really make sure, one, that you definitely have video in place. That's a minimum for dealing with conflict. But even before that, you really want the chance for the teams to connect with each other. So whether you have simple working agreements or you subscribe to something more like a lift-off type of approach where you go a little bit more in depth into what are the strengths and weaknesses of the team and what are each other's tendencies. You want to try to establish those as soon as you can as an Agile coach. So one of the first things I do anytime when I start working with a remote team is I'll just start having one-to-one conversations with them and just see what is it that they feel like they're challenged with, how well do they know each other, and where they feel they might need help. And so as an Agile coach, I try to build those connections as quickly as possible when I first enter one of these remote teams.
Very, very good. So retrospectives and conflict. Now, conflict is something when you just were talking about conflict, isn't that something that would be less common in a distributed way? I mean, I'm just picturing like an office environment where people are together for 8 hours. Here you have a team, somebody you mentioned earlier in Thailand and Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Isn't there like potential for conflict much lower?
So I'll put it this way. Distance has nothing to do with the amount of conflict. It is more where you have people that care about their work, you will have conflict. And it doesn't matter in what scenario they're in. They're going to have different approaches, different ideals, and they are going to want to express those ideals in some form. And so it's helping team members understand what are their tendencies as introverts or extroverts, or whatever tool set you can use to make them aware of how they react to conflict and how others on the team react to it, and how they can use that to the team's advantage, not their personal advantage, but to the team's advantage, to figure out, okay, how can we navigate this? How can we really explore all the options for whatever it is we're having an intellectual debate about. And I will say this, that the majority of the time it is far more intellectual, but there's still emotions involved. There still will be frustration and upset because the people involved are very passionate about what they're working on.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. Fascinating, actually. So for everybody out there listening to Mark's and comments about distributed teams and coaching in this environment, this puts brand new insights to me, to be totally honest, how an organization of that size, entirely distributed, can still operate in an agile fashion. Properly credit to you and your work. Now, let's switch over a little bit to another topic I wanted to talk about, because you're going to appear at the Agile Leadership Conference in Miami, which takes place on the 2nd of November in Miami. And you will present with Stephanie Davis a talk about building community, the power of many. And before we go to the community work, I do have to share a little bit of a personal experience when I came to the Sunshine State for work myself in the, 7 years ago, 2010, somewhere in that neighborhood. There was pretty much nothing going on. I want to be honest with you. In the Florida community,
Right. Yep.
I Googled events, and there was really nothing going on. Now, within 7 years, this has drastically changed. I'm just going to throw some terms out, and then we put them probably a little bit into order. There's Agile Florida, there's Agile Tampa, there's Agile Open Florida, and there is the South Florida Agile Association, the SFAA. So how does this all work together? You're an integral part, and if you're Googling these terms like Agile in Florida, you're going to see a few things popping up. They're not competitive. Right. I think the most important thing is I don't think they're competitive. I think they're all helping each other. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It is a highly collaborative group across the state. So just a slight touch of history. So about 10 years back, 2007, 2008, Tampa Bay Agile was forming, and Agile Orlando was forming, and we were, as any young user group, we were kind of struggling to get established. And there was a South Florida group at that time, but that one kind of faded. Orlando actually fell over twice. We'll put it that way. I won't go into the details. There's actually details on my blog if anybody's really curious. But the third time that we decided to put it back together, a couple things happened. First, I finally took to heart the Agile concept of doing the simplest thing that could possibly work. And so we restarted with lean coffee, and for those who may not be familiar with it, it's just a very simple way of bringing people together to talk about the topics of interest to them. And we regrew Agile Orlando from lean coffee. We actually now have 4 separate ones throughout the space of a month all over Orlando, which is quite large now. And at the same time, Tampa was starting to kind of regrow. And that's when I decided, you know what, I not only need help here in Orlando, but I just want to see what other groups are doing. So I went to the Gemba, so to speak. I went and visited. I used that lean concept, and I said, I'm just going to start visiting these other places. So I went to Tampa and saw what they're doing. Met Stephanie, met her co-founder, Ryan. I talked about what they were doing. Happily did some talks for them. They sent some folks our way, did some talks for us. I actually introduced Lean Coffee to them. Same thing for South Florida. They did their first conference about 3 or 4 years ago, which I think is where we bumped into each other.
That's correct.
Again, and basically showed them some of the things that I had learned through my experience as a consultant Agile coach. And so we continued to look at how we could all collaborate, because Florida is a very big state for those who haven't visited, and so there was room for all, and so with that, from the space of about 2009 to now, we've collaborated on a number of different events, including Agile Open Florida, which is our statewide conference, which uses the open space format, and this year will be our 4th year. It's actually coming up on October 6th, and this year it is in Lakeland, Florida, which is somewhat between Tampa and Orlando, but it's still easy access for the South Florida folks.
Right.
And we try to move it around every couple of years. So the first 2 years it was in Tampa. This year will mark 2017 will mark the 2-year mark for Orlando, and we're hoping to see it in South Florida next year. And the idea is it migrates around to just reconnect the Agile community in Florida.
Yeah. Well, how big is the community now in Florida? I don't know if you have insights into Agile Florida or possibly only into Orlando.
Yeah, well, so Agile. I should say something about Agile Florida as well. So Agile Florida, if you go there, agileflorida.com, if you go there, that's really just the current active user groups. So you'll see Agile Orlando and Tampa and South Florida, Gainesville. There's actually a Jacksonville group that's not on that site yet, but we're trying to get them up on that site. But that's just sort of the umbrella to introduce people to, here's what's happening in Agile in Florida. Here's who you can contact. So they don't have to contact me. They can actually reach out through Agile Florida.
Nice.
And through that as well, there is a Slack community that really connects all of Florida. And so that Slack community is how we do most of the collaboration across the user groups in Florida. We've also, when the Scrum Gathering came here last year to Orlando, that's how we recruited our volunteers and coordinated volunteers that way. And I would say right now, if I have the current counts correct for Tampa and South Florida, we're probably looking at close to 5,500 to 6,000 Agilists across those different user groups that I know of, that I'm aware of.
That is a huge number for sure.
Yeah.
And just imagine, the capital of Florida might also add a user group at some point.
Well, so actually, through the Agile Open Florida Conference, we've had some folks from Tallahassee visit us, which is the capital, and we keep telling them that we're happy to help them start. Go
ahead.
Well, so I was going to say, and of course, Agile Florida helped inspire something through the Agile Alliance as well. So I don't know if you want to get into that now, or we could talk about it later.
No, definitely. Please explore. That's interesting. I'm not aware of that. That would be very interesting.
Yeah. So in 2015 is when Stephanie and I and Alex and Rick from South Florida, we got together and provided an experience report to the Agile 2015 conference, the big conference, talking about this was our experience. And I believe the title was something like, "Is your user group dying? Then form a statewide learning network." That was our response, which is exactly what all three groups did. We were all struggling, and we found our strength in collaboration. And from that, members of the board reached out to us and said, "Hey, do you think you could take this to a larger scale?" And we thought about it. We said, "Yeah, sure." So last year, we launched what's called now the Community Group Support Initiative, which is a member initiative of the Agile Alliance. So now Stephanie and I, and with the help of Craig Smith, who is with, I believe, Agile Brisbane in Australia, we are now collaborating on how do we help any Agile user group get started through this initiative.
Right.
Yeah. So as part of that, we help them get their meetup site set up. We help them connect with other Agile user group leaders, and we're putting together sort of you can think of it as an FAQ for user group leaders. So how do you find the right kind of venue? How do you find sponsors? All those things that a new user group leader would struggle with. And then we'll expand upon that to what do the more successful groups look to next? Like, how do you start your own conference? Because we've all done that. Yeah. So those are the kind of things that we're now doing really worldwide through the Agile Alliance.
And that's a wonderful story. If you had to compare the Florida landscape right now as of 2017 with other states in the United States, based on your work with the Agile Alliance, what kind of insights do you have? Where does Florida rank in terms of user group maturity?
That's a tough one because you could look at it a couple different ways. If you looked at collaboration of neighboring groups, I think Ohio has a very strong network from what I can tell. Certainly the groups in California do quite a bit of collaboration. But if you look at size of conferences, there's several local user groups that have some really impressive conferences, even for regional. So you've got Agile Denver, you've got, of course, the event that you started up in New York City. So it's not so much we look at the maturity, but more how well do these groups serve their local community in that they help educate their members and those outside, and how well do they also help other user groups? So that's the connections we're trying to form right now. One of the topics, we had a meeting at the Agile 2017 conference, and one of the things we talked about is how well do some of these user groups reach out to other groups. So whether it's a PMI group or IABA, which is the business analyst community, or maybe specific technology groups like Docker or Java or .NET or whatever. We shared some of that in papers and blog posts on how can you keep the community connected and continue to share not only what works best for your community, but what could help other communities. So that's where we try to give back and help build those connections. Yeah.
So it sounds like 3 attempts, right? At least for the Orlando user group, and the third one really that stuck, right? So this is to last, and this is the model, right? And you will present on that topic, the building the community. And what's really cool about this talk is you bring Stephanie in with it, right? So we're going to hear both sides of the user groups and how this was a win-win situation. Now, one thing I was wondering when you mentioned Agile 2017 here a minute ago, does a large event like the last conference in 2017, the Agile 2017, the large 5-day conference, does something like that actually help you in the community, or is that actually counterproductive for you as community, because so many people are coming to these large events?
Well, it certainly helps me because I get to connect with many different people, and so does Stephanie. So Stephanie actually was on the Agile Alliance board. She just rolled off. She just finished her 3-year term, and for us, it allows us to connect with potential speakers, such as yourself, who might be coming through the area, and let people let you know that there is a community here. Would love to host and introduce you to our community and share what insights you have. But also, it allows us to connect with some of the other user groups. So we had probably 10 or 12 different user groups represented. There were probably more, but of course, that conference is so crazy with all the simultaneous events. It's hard to get everybody connected. So I would say it helps in that perspective. But another way that it helps, and I don't know how many times a local community takes advantage of this, is when a conference like that rolls into town, how can you give your people who may not be going to the conference access to the speakers? So, for instance, we had Woody Zoll come and do a session on mob programming for Agile Orlando. Tonight, we've got, as I was telling you earlier, Jens Ostergaard, who is a longtime Scrum trainer. Actually, we took our Scrum training together years ago. He's moved to the Orlando area, but he's bringing Alistair Coburn with him because Alistair is still in town after the conference. And so that's a rare treat to get folks like that to come and visit. And so whenever the Agile conference rolls through our town, we try to get additional opportunities for our membership to meet those thought leaders.
Right. This is definitely it's all about being connected, right? Putting these pieces together. That seems to be the secret sauce. I can say only now me spending a little bit more time in the Florida area myself, I can only share that the landscape has entirely changed. When you search for Agile user group events, there's an avalanche of search results, and it's not only for the next 2 weeks. It's out there October, November, and so forth. So if you travel through this area as an Agile coach from out of state and you're interested in one of these events, I'm pretty sure that almost every week there's something going on. The size of the state, though, Florida, because it's so big, obviously puts a little burden on people coming to events from other cities. But hearing that you guys are expanding into other parts of Florida, this is very interesting. What I do think, there's actually two things while we're discussing this, right? There's probably two things going on here. When you, as a community cultivator, and you work for Sonotype, and you have a ton of experience of distribution, and in large states like Florida or let's say Texas and so forth, there might be even a way for these very rural areas in the United States which can't meet in person, but maybe they want to reach out to you and see how you do it for the company, because that is something they might be mapping to a user group. I was just thinking out loud here. But on the other side, is this whole thing, we're talking about these two topics here, and your workplace being your home office, and then the community work. Is the community work also something for you where you can meet people in person? Mm-hmm. Is that something you take away as a big plus?
Oh yeah, definitely. So for Sonotype, even though we're distributed, we still value face-to-face. So not only do we get our entire engineering group together once a year, but for kicking off special features and new products, we'll bring people together. So usually people within the company will have an opportunity to meet face-to-face 2 or 3 times a year, and that's still not enough.
Right. Yeah.
So as part of that, we encourage people to go out and connect with their local user groups, or if they want to work in a co-working space, we'll look for ways to support them in that. We have a few digital nomads that, as long as they can find good bandwidth, they will go wherever and make and meet commitments to their team still, but at the same time they're visiting beautiful places all over the planet. But again, connection's important.
Connection's important, yeah.
Yeah, so connection is just as important for me, and so going out and meeting these folks. So I have not been able to do it as much this year as I have in past years, but there was a time where I was going to all 4 Lean Coffees in Orlando, just because I got to meet the different people across the city, and would road trip occasionally to Tampa, South Florida, about 4 hours away from me. So that's a little bit longer drive, but but it would not be unusual for me to road trip around the state. So it's making those connections and showing people that you're willing to invest the time, that you're willing to invest in them. I think that's important.
Absolutely.
And that's why I do it.
Well, I want to thank you for the work you're doing for these communities, because definitely this has transformed the way the community works now. If you are interested in hearing more about this and seeing actually examples, and as part of an open space, obviously in the conference at the Agile Leadership Conference in Miami on the 2nd of November, everybody has access to Mark. There's also another access that is markkilby.com, and there is Twitter, mkilby, and there's email addresses, and there is Agile Florida, and all these things we talked about in this conference. There should be a way of how to connect either with you or with other people in your network and be a part of this. Thank you so much for your time, Mark.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity, Joe.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.